the conversation I had a few days ago with Dr. Kenneth Medlock over at Rice University and the Baker Institute for Public Policy. And he is a senior energy economist there, and the kind of guy who always has very little time because he's spread out across a lot of different initiatives. So very cool of him to make some time for me and help shed some light on these questions here, and in particular on the first one. So this is an economist point of view, what's happening right now in the oil industry. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll get into these next parts. What does that mean for me, and how should I spend my time as a result? So what's happening in the oil industry? The backdrop here is this is the demand for oil. And it's not to scale here, I just drew a triangle, but the point is that it's growing and has been growing for a little while. So there's more people, there's more development in developing countries. The economy was good, so more demand for oil as a result. The supply, however, is this big. The supply was outstripping the demand. And so there's not just more supply, but it was growing at a faster rate. And that had been true for a little bit. And what that was doing was driving down the price of oil. So if it's cheaper in onshore upstream US to contribute and start producing oil, the barrier to entry has come down, then companies can spend less and more companies can start doing it. And so there's more oil and that drives down the price. Then it makes it harder for those companies. So already there were some challenges, and we saw over the course of the last couple of years that some companies were setting people on unpaid leave, like furloughs, reducing staff and reducing salaries for the staff they still had, and some were getting acquired or were going bankrupt. So that was kind of the backdrop already, but it wasn't necessarily the best time in the oil industry. And then just recently, there have been three big shocks, just kind of wham, wham, right after one after another, two on the demand side and one on the supply side. So the first demand side shock was just that we had a warm winter. When you have a warm winter, you're consuming less oil products. There's less oil going into heating. And so that means that even though you've produced the oil, assuming that there would be more demand like there normally is, there isn't that demand, so you create more inventory. Even as that inventory is exhausted, it's mixed with the new inventory as more oil comes in, and that just lowers the price even more. So the gap is stretched between supply and demand. Next shock, and this is the one that everyone's thinking about, I think, talking about the most here, was just the coronavirus pandemic. And estimates showed that, it was last week, the amount of demand for oil dropped by between 4 and 7 million barrels per day. So people are staying home, they're not driving, they're not flying. People might be eager to hoard certain goods, but overall there's less transportation of goods. Basically, overnight, the service sector shut down. So that creates a huge surplus in supply as compared to the demand. And again, all that supply has to go into inventory, which has to be exhausted before the price will come back up. So even if COVID-19 ends right away, it's going to take a little bit for the price to creep back up. So that gap was increased pretty extreme there because of COVID-19, and it stayed kind of that way. So the next one is on the supply side, and this was just the announcement from Saudi Arabia that they plan to add an additional production of between 2 and 3 million barrels of oil per day to a market that already seems flooded that way. And that has to do with kind of a game of chicken between all the countries that are producing oil. Hey, if we make it really cheap, then the organizations or the national oil companies that can't survive will have to scale back. And then we can scale back too, and that way there's more money for the organizations that are producing. So even though this hasn't fully come online yet, the fact that it was announced has already caused the price to drop a lot. So we have a big gap because of that as well. So all three of these things happening pretty much simultaneously caused a giant cumulative shock to the oil industry. So that shock is is much bigger than the gap we were already facing when we go back to the backdrop. But if we take the two lines, the supply and the demand, and we stretch them out far enough in the future, we get the same gap. So that wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have had, the supply continue to outstrip the demand. There would be gradual market corrections, and we would have seen kinds of furloughs and reductions in headcounts and bankruptcies, that sort of thing that we had been seeing over the course of the last year, year and a half, 2 years, continue at that pace. But instead, just because it's all these shocks are here, it's happening all at once. So what does that mean for me? What does that mean for people in the oil and gas industry? The me here is a collective me. Like what does that mean for us? So the oil price here, like think of a line, it can be high and low on this line. Let's put a dot on that line somewhere and say that this is our company's break-even price. So as long as the price of oil is higher than this break-even price, then we're making money, we're profitable. As soon as that oil price drops below, then every day that goes by, we're losing money. And we can't do that because, especially if we're publicly traded, we have to shareholders. So we do whatever it takes to drop our costs below that price on a per barrel basis. So that means we start reducing salary, and we start sending people on unpaid leave, and we start considering layoffs. So another way to look at this, if we look at the oil price as compared to the ease of survival of any company in the oil industry, whether they're an operator, a service provider, a vendor, something like that, it's kind of a line here, and maybe it's even the line bends exponentially up. So the ease of survival goes way up as the oil price goes up. And if the oil price goes down, then the ease of survival goes way down. So as long as the oil price was high, many companies could survive. But as soon as the oil price drops, then only a few companies can actually survive. So this is the reality now. There's fewer companies going forward here. And so it's worthwhile looking at, it's not like the oil industry is going to disappear. I think prices will come back up gradually. They'll just come back up with a new landscape of fewer companies. So who are these fewer companies and what's special about them? These companies, what differentiates them is efficiency. So the reason why they were still profitable and still able to survive and grow during a time when there's a big shock like this and the oil price is low is because of their efficiency. And there's two types of efficiencies that matter here. One is scale efficiency. So we're just talking about big companies. So if a company is really big, say instead of buying one piece of equipment for X dollars and deploying it in one operation at a time, if they buy, say, 5 pieces of equipment for 0.75 times the cost, they deploy all 5 because they're bigger and have need for all 5. Well, that margin of 25% is their efficiency of scale. So if you're a bigger company, you just can play with things like that and things go better for you generally. This one is maybe less immediately intuitive here, but the other kind of major efficiency is operational efficiency, and that's driven by technology that makes use of data. So the companies that are data-centric are the companies that generate data, which means they don't just carry out their operations, they take notes, they review things and write summaries and reports. They review those summaries and reports and write bigger cumulative summaries and reports. They use sensors to figure out what's going on. They take measurements and write them down and compare them over time. They're generating data. And a lot of oil companies are good at that. We generate a lot of data, so we have a lot of valuable data around. But we tend to be pretty unorganized, and our data tends to be pretty siloed. So the companies that have really checked this data-centric box are the ones that have organized their data. So if the data is unstructured, they structure it. If the data is lost somewhere in a silo, they make it accessible and they plug it into other data. And then once they have this data that's organized, they utilize that data. So let's say you have 2 different kinds of processes going that are meant to solve the same goal inside of your company. If you utilize your data, you can effectively sense that one process is less efficient than the other. So you replace that one with the more efficient process. Just a quick general example. There's all kinds of things you can do with your data to generate efficiency once you have it organized. So this isn't to say that it's just one or the other. There's some overlap here. So the companies in the center there are the best off right now. So I'm drawing this big oval here, and consider it that it's a geographical depiction. So there used to be companies that are now in the red on this Mario mustache graph here. There used to be companies that were they had leases and were operating in in areas where the green companies had leases and were operating. But because the oil price is low, these companies are going to leave the scene. In order to cut their costs, they have to sell their assets. They lose people, but they also lose land. But the rock is still there, and the oil is still in that rock. And so the companies that are doing well get to buy those leases, and they buy those leases at really cheap prices. And so then they gradually take over where it makes sense to lease, and you're left with an industry that looks less like this Mario mustache and more like the eye of Sauron here. The green eye is the new industry. So, okay, that's what things mean for you, is that we're headed towards accelerated, it's already the writing on the wall, but now it's kind of the reality, this green eye industry. So how should you spend your time given that this is the new industry? I think the question to ask logically from that is, what do these companies want from me? How do I be relevant and matter to these green eye companies? And I think there's two things that they want from you, two broad categories. The first is your experience in the industry. If you're already in the oil and gas industry, you're going to be able to hit the ground running at an oil and gas company and add a lot more value right away than, say, somebody who's fresh out of school. So you have something really good going for you here that makes you very competitive as compared to anybody else who's thinking about joining the oil and gas industry. The second thing, and I think a lot of practitioners in oil and gas have some room for improvement here, is on the data-centric skill set. So if you want one of those jobs with a data-centric company, you got to have a data-centric skill set, and that's worth looking into a little bit more. So what is a data-centric skill set? I think there are 4 parts to it. The first is you have some innovation acculturation. Second is you're data-driven. The third is you're project-oriented, and the fourth is that you are proficient in software yourself. So when you think about how you should spend your time, I recommend you spend some of your time, think about how much work you have to do in your calendar, and maybe it takes a little bit longer to do that work because, like Jim was saying, you've got kids at home and other kinds of family obligations that are exacerbated because of the stay-home social distancing right now. But you also don't have a commute, and it's worthwhile making time teaching yourself about these 4 skill sets, really investing, and like those tools we talked about before, talk to other people about what's working for you and what's worked for them, and what your opinions are as they evolve when you pursue these things. So what do I mean by innovation acculturation? I mean that you can recognize viable opportunities to augment, like improve, or overhaul, like replace, processes where it makes sense to do that. So rather than just like, here's my job description, I do it and I'm done and I go home, you're always thinking about, how could I do this better? Or do we even need to do this? Can I automate this? Can I do something innovative to add value to the company on top of what's traditionally just expected? Second is data-driven. So how do you know whether your concept for innovation is actually going to be successful? You have to produce the data that helps to warrant the success or failure of that idea. So you have to be able to use relevant data, determine what data is relevant, and then use it accurately and wisely to inform your personal and your team and your organizational decisions. So that's an important skill set to develop there. Third, project-oriented. If you know how to use data, then you start to learn about project orientation, so you can get a sense of how long it would take to collect certain types of data to try to achieve whatever the innovation is that you had the spark for. So if you think about like, oh, maybe, here's a creative idea, this might work. If you're project oriented, you know how to actually set up the right resources, predict how long it'll take and how hard it will be. And then fourth and finally is the software proficiency. You want to be able to execute your own software engineering. your own data science and your own artificial intelligence projects, even if you're not like a super expert at this and one of the people who can go the deepest in this area. If you know enough to be dangerous and get your hands dirty, you can create a lot of value just in your own job scope, just by automating certain things or creating certain tools yourself that help you with your job. But it also will help you with all these other things, because you'll know how to scope a project, because you know how hard it is to create that kind of software that's needed to drive that project. You know how to leverage the data, and you know what data is useful and how it can be organized, and what the comparative advantages and limitations are in data science methodologies. So these are the 4 things that I recommend that you focus on to get that data-centric skill set. A few specific tools, and this is kind of like the tool section that I did earlier. I'm not necessarily recommending any of these, but some of them make a lot of sense for sure. So software proficiency, if you learn Visual Basic, a huge percentage, 90+% of the data in oil and gas is stored in Excel, and it's locked away in different Excel files here and there. So if you learn Visual Basic, that's the programming language that manipulates Excel. So that's pretty powerful. Python is very popular, SQL, there's R, there's a whole bunch of these things for data science and for general software that could be useful when you're creating something for an oil company. Project oriented, you can learn about methodologies here. There's Agile and Scrum, there's a whole bunch of these kinds of things. Data driven, learn about machine learning algorithms, learn about their advantages and disadvantages. They're already being put to use all over the world and creating enormous value. So get in on that. Like, what does k-means? When do you use it, and how can it help you? What's random forest? That'll give you ideas that you can do to help your company stay really relevant in the industry. And then innovation acculturation. If you check out how startups work and what best practices are for startups, startups have to solve this problem that they don't even know exists. They have to create a company, you have to find a problem, and then you have to learn how you can solve it, and you have to be really scrappy and quick. So if you learn startup best practices, you can apply them in the workplace, and you don't have to take a huge risk like an entrepreneur does, but you can be much more effective in a steady job. Design thinking is a general tool for innovation that's very powerful and has had a lot of success around the world. The basic concept is you harness your creativity to focus in on what is a really good problem worth solving. And then you harness your creativity to think about how can I scientifically and very quickly iterate through possible examples using data until I get to one that actually works and is proven. So I recommend, again, that you talk about these kinds of things with others. There's so many different software classes you can take online. There's so many different videos you can watch about design thinking, how to be a good project manager, things like that. I think the right approach here is to pick ones that are focused on the industry. So you're not learning anything superfluous, and what you are learning that's general is the examples are applicable to the industry. So check out the bit.ly link here to the Inly Slack channel, and then you can talk to other people about it and start to learn what's working for them and what you think works better for you, and have those kinds of conversations. So what we're going to share in this Slack here, the slide deck that has been this presentation, as well as the sources behind the slide deck, and there's a whole bunch of those. Lots of people have very generously contributed. Here's what we're doing at my company. I've been say working from home for years and years. Here's some tips that my company can provide. We're going to list the specific tools and let people talk about them. We're going to keep providing industry and coronavirus updates. A lot of leaders, Jim Claunch included, have been generous and are sharing their own tips and tricks. So you can get a top-down view of this kind of stuff too, which is very helpful. And then you can just have conversations about the industry and about working from home. Inspired by Jim and the concept of the community happy hours inside of a company, a lot of people, whether you're introverted or extroverted, benefit from going out and talking to people in the oil and gas industry. You go to conferences, you go to happy hours, or you go hear a talk over lunch or something like that, and you meet other people who you don't know who are in the industry. It gives you perspective, it gives you ideas, it keeps you motivated and grounded, and So we're going to set that up inside of this Slack channel so that you can join a support group based on your preferences, like when you want to meet and how big of a group do you prefer and how often do you want to meet, that kind of thing. So you can sign up inside of there. So I recommend you follow us in this resource. So I want to end with a quote here from Catherine Mills. She runs one of the most successful podcasts on iTunes, like ever. So tons and tons of listeners. She's pretty funny. She's great. She's great. She's right to the point, and she has a lot of perspective because there's so many people from different parts of the industry who have been on her show and who she talks to all the time. And her quote here is like, I asked her, hey, what do you think people need to do in the oil and gas industry? She said, listen, people need to gear themselves up for the fact that the future of the patch is quite a different landscape than the one of the past. Prepare for the rise of the digital twin. Prepare for a new definition of lean workforce. Prepare yourselves for industry transitions. I myself have to square with these inevitabilities. Our industry is facing too many challenges at the moment, and not enough voices are speaking up on behalf of the humanity of the oil field. Yes, the demand for oil and gas will always be around, but that does not make anyone immune to the brutality of the industry. You stay in it because you love it. Regardless, the future of the patch is digital. That means Python, SQL R, and automation. Prepare for that. All right, so I'm going to end it there. Jim, any parting thoughts or?
No, just thank everyone for listening in and join the Slack channel. And let's just keep the learning going between ourselves.
All right. Thanks a ton. Appreciate your helping me record this.
You bet.
See you later.
Bye-bye.